So welcome everybody, and this is an event on immigration reporting and the ethical issues that it raises. It's being sponsored by the Ethics in Journalism Initiative here at NYU. Let me introduce our moderator. I am so thrilled that he is doing this. He's Mazen Sadamid, and Mazen is the founder, co-founder, and co-executive director of Documented. If you don't know Documented, you should look it up. It's a really extraordinary news organization, news site that covers immigrants, and they say they write about immigrants and for immigrants in New York City. They're doing journalism in a really interesting, original, and important way. So I'm so happy to have him. Mazen has reported in the Middle East. He's reported in New York. He worked for Guardian US, covered the 2016 election. He also worked in Beirut and covered immigration, covered migration issues, internal migration issues, and all the really important issues that were going on in the Middle East. Mazen is a real leader in this field and somebody who I'm so thrilled is here. I should also mention that 2 weeks ago, he won a Freedom of the Press Award from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. That's an organization very close to my heart because I chair the board. And Mazen won the Local Champion Award, which he entirely deserves. So please join me in welcoming Mazen Sadamid.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Steve. It's so great to be here in this amazing new institute and to talk about this really timely topic. We have an incredible panel with us today that I'm going to introduce here with those bios. But I really want this panel to be about demystifying some of the challenges of covering immigration. I think when I was a student reporter, I often felt like there was a right way to do things. And I think we're really going to try and explore the fact that it's just complicated and it's messy. And we're going to try and dive into all the different elements and maybe touch on the election that's happening pretty soon as well. All right, so let's start with some introductions. I'll start with Micah Rosenberg, an investigative reporter on ProPublica's national desk focusing on immigration. She previously worked at Reuters, where she and her colleagues published a 2022 investigation exposing migrant child labor in the US. The series spurred government investigations, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and won a George Polk Award. Her work explored rising death tolls and changing demographics at the US-Mexico border, revealed disparities in COVID-19 infections among immigrant communities, and the government negligence that caused unnecessary deaths in immigration detention. She also worked on projects examining some of the long-standing inequities in the immigration court system, a really rich area of coverage. Rosenberg began her career at Reuters in Guatemala, finding dispatches on extrajudicial prison killings and the legacy of the country's representative or repressive human rights history. She later became a senior correspondent in Mexico City and reported from 10 countries across the region, including Haiti, Honduras, and Venezuela. Please join me in welcoming Micah. Jonathan Blitzer is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He won a 2017 National Award for Education Reporting for American Studies, a story about an underground school of undocumented immigrants. He's been a finalist 3 times for the Livingston Awards and is the recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award and the 2018 Immigration Journalism Prize for the French American Foundation. His writing and reporting have also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Atavist, Oxford American, and The Nation. He was a 2021 Emerson Fellow at New America. His first book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis, was published in January 2024. Great to have you here. Thanks so much. And last but not least, we have Gwyn Hogan, a senior reporter at the nonprofit local news site, The City, where she covers the borough of Brooklyn, migration, politics, among other subjects. She was named Journalist of the Year for the Newswomen's Club of New York for her coverage of the migration crisis. Before her time at The City, she was also a reporter at New York's public radio station WNYC, and I believe DNA Info, or no?
Also DNA Info.
The legendary DNA Info. Thanks, so great to have you here, Gwyn. Great. Yeah. Oh, we all love DNA Info. It's a very special news site. If you don't know, you should look it up. It's a really important site for New York City. Great. So let's start by talking about really the kind of going out and reporting, covering and interviewing immigrants themselves. You know, as a reporter on the beat, you're really meeting immigrants and in some of the most vulnerable moments in their lives, like people who are kind of in a moment of crisis. You could be at the border, you could be at the shelter. Sometimes you're in these choreographed interviews that are organized by advocates. How do you balance telling these stories with proper journalistic principles while ensuring there's ethical treatment and your sources that feel like they have dignity as they go through this process? Let's start with you, Jonathan. How do you typically approach the interview process when you're meeting immigrants?
I would say I operate with sort of three principles in mind. And the first is, and this is a luxury I have just given where I work, where I've got a little time and space around some of the things I'm reporting. I actually often, particularly when I'm talking to someone who's in a precarious position at a kind of tumultuous moment, is I almost start kind of outside of the journalistic frame and kind of introduce myself the way I would introduce myself under normal circumstances, and explain a little bit what it is I'm up to, who I am, why we're having the conversation, because I don't think those things are obvious. I don't think those things are necessarily intuitive. And depending on obviously the environment in which you're working, sometimes you go to Washington, you are reporting in and around New York City. There tends to be more awareness of what it means to be in a conversation with a journalist. But I think out in the world, it's not fair to assume that someone is fully read into what all of that means. And so even before we kind of launch into anything, and I actually have sort of physical shows of where this is. So like I don't take out a notebook at first. When I do get to that stage of the conversation, I'm not theatrical about it, but I make clear that, okay, now we're kind of entering this space together, just to very kind of clearly delineate sort of what it is that we're doing. And I do say to people, and I really do mean it, that if you're not comfortable talking, if you have doubts about me or about the process, you owe me no explanations. And this leads to the kind of second principle for me, which to me is sacrosanct, and that is the security of the person you're writing on, the well-being of the person you're writing on is paramount. And if that means not pursuing a story, then that means not pursuing a story. But to me, that is kind of the be-all and end-all in every circumstance. And my final thing is, as we do move forward with the conversation, I just want to be very honest and transparent about the fact that I don't know what will come out of the story. I think it's unfair, it's misleading, and I think it's dangerous to imply somehow that there is like particular utility for someone in talking to you. Like, I don't think it would be wonderful if a story comes out and it materially improves that person's situation or the situation of others. But I think you really have to take pains not to promise or imply that any of those things will eventually happen. And you have to rely on the fact that someone will relate to you insofar as you're a listener, engaging respectfully and empathetically with what they're trying to tell you. That's the principal nature of the relationship, not that there's any expectation that as a result of this conversation, X, Y, or Z might happen. And I think that you will feel the urge to get that in somehow, because these conversations they're not natural really in any sense. The journalistic enterprise is a strange one. And so, in my earliest days doing this, I felt a definite urge, almost like a physical need to say, look, well, here's what I think might happen. If we're responsible about this and everything, sort of falls in the right place, there's a possibility that some people might read it and might understand this or that. And I realized that sort of thing was more about making myself feel better than it was about looking out for the other person and understanding the situation that they're in. And so I think it's very important to kind of overcome that very normal human impulse that you yourself feel to diffuse the essential awkwardness of a conversation like that.
Mike, did you want to jump off next?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that Jonathan said, and I think the other, thing that you mentioned in your question as well is that a lot of times, you're meeting people, where they are. Maybe they're, you've just sort of happened upon them, but other times there's places where you're sort of meeting them with an intermediary. I think especially in the immigration reporting, there are, or there's organizations that are working with immigrants. There's people who may be in detention or they may be with their lawyers, so I think it's very important, as Jonathan says, to kind of make an independent, connection and relationship with the people that you're talking to so that they know sort of what you're role is as a journalist that's different than, maybe some of the other people that are there. It could be that they're, with their lawyer who has certain interests in, the things that they should and shouldn't say, or that, they're an advocate group who, maybe has their view of what the person wants to share, but then the person wants to share, more than what the advocates are saying, or less, or, or they're in a situation where they may be, fearful if they're in detention about what they can or cannot say. So I think, and some of that takes time and maybe multiple conversations, and and kind of being able to go back to people, maybe meeting them in that first instance, and getting what you can out, if there's somebody else there, and then saying, can I come back to you? Can we have our own conversation? Can we, talk again, and sort of be able to you continually check in with them. And I think sort of another point on that is that sometimes over the process, people will change how they feel. In the beginning, they might be very hesitant, and then, as they kind of understand more, what's going on, they may open up more, or the reverse. And I think that you should be open to that some people may feel one way, in one conversation, and then differently. And then, in the point of right before publication, when you say, okay, this is what is going to, come out publicly, make sure that they know, and that, which is just sort of typical in any journalism practice, sort of a no surprises approach, so that, that they're, completely clear and read in, at every step of the process, just as you would with a company, or a, or a CEO or a politician. Give them that sort of same level of respect, to, keep them in, to make sure that you're sort of treating them with that level of, dignity.
Gwen, I think your experience is super interesting too, because, as my asylum seeker started, like, Gwen has been really one of the leading journalists in New York City on asylum seekers arriving in New York. But this wasn't a beat that you had experience in before, but you've really, led the charge. Can you talk about what it was like to get dropped into that, and, how the ethical challenges, how you navigate some of those ethical challenges?
Yeah, I I think I think I've covered sort of a lot of breaking news situations, and I do think that there are similar principles that you bring in crisis reporting, whether somebody has just lost their home in a fire or a storm. Like, you sort of greet people as the humans that they are in this really difficult situation. And I do think that migrants arriving here are in sort of a similar crisis state, where you have to be really sensitive with people, and giving them sort of a lot more leeway than you would a politician, or sort of a typical person you might interview in another context. And I do think there are a lot of parallels between that type of sort of emergency reporting, and migrants who are being bussed in and they haven't eaten and they haven't had medical care, and they're sort of in an extreme state when they first arrive. And then over time, people are stabilizing and they're having lives in New York, and that is, multifaceted and different and interesting in different ways. And just kind of to add on to what you guys were saying, I think the importance of continuous consent. And if that means somebody said something on the record and they don't want to say it on the record anymore, I think you have to be understanding if the point of the mission is to really elevate their human story. So yeah.
So thank you for that. So I feel like one of the takeaways I'm taking from what all of you said is continuous consent and informed consent. So folks actually knowing what it means to speak with you, and what the benefits of that be and what they might not be. And I love what you said, Micah, about thinking of treating people with the same dignity you would a company or a politician. I think a lot of times folks have a paternalistic relationship with immigrant communities, and they don't treat them with that same level of dignity and respect. So just thinking about their consequences for them in the same ways is really important. Let's dive into language. So all of you speak Spanish, correct? And French, is that right as well? A little bit. Okay, cool. So this is something that comes up a lot, I think, for reporters in the field, is how they kind of navigate when they're meeting folks that don't speak the same languages. What are the kind of ethical considerations? Who you can work with as a translator? Is it okay to use family members? Yeah, and like the kind of consequences that come from some of the different decisions. Do you want to start, Gwen?
I mostly have not. Sorry, I mostly have not worked with a translator. I do. I mean, it's amazing. I did once or twice when I was sort of tagging along with a This American Life reporter. Somebody who spoke Wolof. I usually communicate with people in French, which is like from West African countries. That's not their first language. In some cases, some cases it is, and they learn in school. But like, so there's like multiple levels of translation happening, and just being able to be with the translator was like, whoa! Like the sort of the depth of conversation was much deeper. And obviously it's great if you like. I'm much more comfortable in Spanish, and I think that that does, like, when you're able to have that immediate uh, communication with somebody in their first language, I think that does sort of open a door for you, like, and even just sort of comparing my French and my Spanish, like the sort of the breadth of conversation is much wider when you're able to communicate directly. If you don't speak a language, I think being able to translate will sort of, I think, help you have a deeper experience with your interviewee.
Yeah, well, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying too about the intermediaries, that oftentimes, if you're, there are even people who are Spanish speakers who come, especially in Latin America, will come with like indigenous languages. And there's like so many different indigenous languages that there's like, it's sometimes hard to find, the translators that are correct. But I think that it's always, when you endeavor to find somebody who speaks a language, even if it's, an obscure language, that people are really appreciative. And I think that it's another sort of level of saying, I'm trying to, get your perspective as clearly as I can. And, but then sometimes that means that it's maybe the person that works for the organization, or maybe it's, their family member. And I think if it's somebody who works for an organization, as long as it's the same sort of ground rules, right, that you want them to know that like this isn't part of them talking with you isn't part of, them getting services or, any kind of obligation or anything, that it's a separate thing. And that sometimes, that's why maybe it's like if it's a family member, it might be better because maybe you want to ask the family member something too, and that you sort of get an extra, interviewee out of it. And, I would just say like sort of just, tricks would, tools would be that you would just be reporting all the time if they're comfortable with that, because then you could, when you sort of get to the point where you're trying to get quotes and stuff, you can potentially take that back to somebody who has an even higher level of, whatever language it is. Because I think sometimes often things get lost in translation, especially if you're working with like a family member or somebody who, for their own particular reasons might not want to translate certain things in the way that, or might feel uncomfortable. So aside from that, but I agree with Gwen that like, it's always better if you can get somebody who speaks the language.
So there wasn't like a set policy at Reuters or ProPublica around who could act as a translator. It was more fluid based on the circumstances.
I mean, I don't know. We should ask the former editor-in-chief, but I think it was mostly, based on your judgment, and to as much as possible, we would like at Reuters, it was lucky because it was a global organization. We could often find people, Senegalese colleagues who could speak Wolof, we'd rhyme, which was always sort of the best if you have another journalist who speaks the language. And then from there, it's, just sort of your judgment of where you can find people. I mean, there are these sort of language services where you can call in, on telephones, and, sometimes those are charged. I don't think those are as good because it's, complicated, but, I think there's creative ways to think about how to kind of, find people that speak the language.
I think you guys have covered the kind of translation elements really well. The only thing I would add to it, and it's going to sound almost like a kind of corny reinterpretation of the question, but I do find that kind of in immigration reporting and writing generally, there is a certain editorial expectation, I'm sure we can all commiserate in this sense, that the people who are going through a particular situation are somehow going to be fully articulate about what they're going through. which is not a fair or reasonable thing to expect of anyone, whether it is a matter of trauma or a matter of bureaucratic complexity or even just the kind of rapid plot of something someone has just gone through. When you're having these conversations with people, I find that it's most important and most valuable for all involved to be as specific as possible. I think there is an editorial inclination to have every figure or so-called character in a story kind of be able to reflect cogently on their situation or on their identity. And I think you, as the reporter in these scenarios, are a kind of translator mediating the kind of needs of a story as considered in the abstract by an editor, say, in New York or wherever, and people out in the world living their lives. And so that also means that it puts a lot of pressure on you with your questions to be very deliberate and pointed in your questions and to be able to read someone's response and to get a sense. Some people are incredibly voluble and articulate about what they're going through. That's rare. I mean, it's great when that happens, but that doesn't always happen. And yet sometimes people will say profound things and very important things that are more circumstantial or specific that you have to kind of do the work of excavating around, either by asking a question in a certain way or kind of sensing that someone's sensibility tends in a certain direction and kind of following them. But just to point, I mean, that sort of goes without saying up here, but I think is an important thing to note.
No, it's definitely huge. I think it's, it's an unreasonable expectation a lot of times when you're doing this type of reporting. To that point, you're definitely very intimately involved with people who are going through very traumatic events, navigating all these different challenges. Sometimes you're spending days, in the case of your book, years with an individual really learning about their lives. I think the thing that I've grappled with a lot in my career is like, what happens the day after the story is published? You've built this deep relationship, this real bond, and it feels jarring to just, not engage afterwards. And oftentimes people have asks of you. I would love if each of you could share maybe examples or things from your career that you've grappled with around this question of what happens to that relationship beyond the publication of the story. Do you want to start us off, Michael?
I mean, it's a tough one. I think that part of it, and it's sort of, I think the running theme of what we're talking about is sort of meeting people where they are. I think there's some people who, the story comes out, they say, you send it to them, they say, thank you very much, that's fine. And, some people, want to stay in touch and check in. And I think, I think you just sort of respond in depending on what people are open to. And I think it's I think in a lot of these things, and there's lines where, sometimes you'll write something and then readers or somebody will want to help out in a very specific way about the person that you wrote about. And so I think that there's some things like that where, you should have conversations with your editors and, make sure that, that there's, if the person is okay, if the editor's okay with it and the person's okay with, you sharing the number or, somehow if there's some way to connect them or if you connect them through an organization or something or not. And I think that those are, complex conversations and should be sort of taken on an individual basis, based on the story and what the person wants and what the person, who wants to help wants. And so I think it's one of those things where it's really sort of case by case. And then there's always cases where people sort of afterwards, they want help from you as a person, maybe they were deported to Liberia and they keep, contacting you because they want to, and you just sort of have to, say, well, I'm a journalist. I'm sorry. I talk to your lawyer. There's certain things where you have to kind of also, also make clear kind of your role, both, pre and post publication, I think.
Specifically, I think something that comes up for a lot of students is around navigating the immigration system. Like, folks, I'd love if all of you could touch on that. Is that, somebody wants help with an application or to review something, or just generally have questions about how things work? Like, how do you typically navigate that?
Yeah, I usually try to be sort of as, I usually try to make a pretty significant delineation as my role. Even if I do maybe know what they should and shouldn't do because I've been covering this for so long, like I really, try to say, look, I'm sorry, like that's not my area of expertise. Like the only thing that I'm doing is listening to your story and publishing it, and for any of that kind of, I don't want to give you the wrong advice, or I don't want to say anything. So, please, talk to an organization or a lawyer. And I usually also, and everybody may sort of have a different view on this, but I usually don't refer them to people, even if I know that there's organizations that might help, just because, if something goes wrong in that relationship afterwards, I don't want to be an intermediary to that. So, that I think that, everybody can maybe makes a different decision about that, but that's how I do it, is sort of make a very clear line between, our relationship is about the story and about, what I'm writing and what I'm publishing. And I can give you any information on that and, how that will work. But anything else outside of that, it's not my area.
Yeah, I feel like I think it is like I've interviewed many people, as I'm sure both of you have, and like almost like I would say 98 out of 100 of them ask me for a job, which like you're like I can't do that. Like I think I gave the example the other day of somebody asked me to be their guardian, and I'm like I don't know, and I like unlike you guys, I have no expertise in immigration law, so it's a lot easier for me to be like no idea. But like I do think I differ with you a little in that like I can be like, look, I'm a reporter. This is not my area of expertise. Here's like an org, or like here's multiple organizations, or like here's a place where you can go for food. Like I will share like where there's like a free store where you can get clothing. Like I'm definitely open to like sharing the resources that I know because I've been sort of plugged into that. But yeah, in terms of like what can I actually do for you, I really try to keep it, like you said, as much of a line as possible.
Yeah, no, I think so much of this also is just context dependent, which is I know is an unsatisfying answer, but so much it just depends on the circumstances that someone's in, the circumstances in which you meet someone, and so on. My like personal sort of stance and just impulse is always to want to rush in and help. That's just how I am, and I've actually tried. I've tried to curb that the deeper I've gotten into this work. I mean, I've never done anything irresponsible, officially. But I think it is important to check some of your impulses where they may have more to do with you wanting to bring some tiny measure of justice to a world that seems completely awry. And that's a worthy thing to feel, but a thing that you are going through yourself emotionally that doesn't necessarily concern the other person or is even in the best interest of the other person. So I tend to, to use a phrase that's come up a number of times, to sort of meet the person where he or she is. And people have different needs in different moments of their life. And so I always make very clear to them, like, this is how you reach me. Here I am. I will always be responsive. Some people, avail themselves of that immediately and just want to check in or share stuff. I'm responsive. Sometimes they kind of don't want to engage too much. Maybe a conversation with me reminds them too much of something that they want to put out of their head for a while. Also respect that. Personally, I'm comfortable. I am very uncomfortable giving advice, mainly because I find this stuff also labyrinthine and complex. That I'm like perpetually fearful that I'm misunderstanding something, or that a policy will change, or there's like a bureaucratic kind of nuance that I maybe only half or dimly know about or don't know about at all. So I am very liberal and comfortable in referring people. I kind of feel like, for me, the baseline is I will put you in touch with lawyers I know. I can't, people, organizations, lawyers I respect. Beyond that, and Micah makes a good point. I mean, it's tricky because if something goes awry in that relationship, does that sort of implicate you? Are you forced to mediate in some way? that just hasn't happened to me. But I feel very comfortable personally, at least directing someone to experts. And in that sense, I feel like I'm kind of happily a kind of go-between in that more general sense.
And you're also comfortable, it sounds like, yeah, developing a relationship that maybe evolves beyond source and to like more of like a friendship beyond that afterwards as well.
Yeah, it's like there is something. I do this work because of the people. That's what drives me to do journalism work in general, and this work specifically. That's always been the case. And it will always be the case. That's what thrills me. That's what, to me, like just drives me to fight through a lot of the journalistic annoyances along the way. But there is something a little bit unsavory and awkward about journalistic work, and that is you have these relationships that, if you're doing the job right, are real meaningful relationships that you have with people. You're relating to people on their terms or as much as you can. You're being empathetic, you're being thoughtful, you're really listening. And yet you're also a journalist, and that means that you have an impulse to tell those stories, or you hear a detail that seems promising or interesting, and that's something maybe that you want to run down. And I don't know that there's a clear answer to how you manage that. Like, for me, a lot of the people I write about, I remain in touch with. A great number of people I write about, we kind of stay in touch for a little while and they drop off, or I drop off, or whatever. But there's a kind of storytelling utility in staying in touch with someone over the long haul. I mean, it's fascinating. Imagine just seeing how someone's story develops, or how their sensibility changes, or what their needs are and how they evolve or not. I'm always open and game for exploring that for stories, and I would lie if I told you I just stayed in touch with people for the kind of general sort of generosity of our relationship. No, I mean, I enjoy interacting with people. That's why I'm doing it. But yeah, I'm never turning off the journalistic brain through all of it. And I just think to make sure you don't ever, I do think that there's like a little bit of a tension always between what you're driven to want to keep pursuing as a journalist and what, as a human being, you maybe feel like, this is maybe coming a little close to crossing a line into whatever, over persistence, willful obliviousness to certain cues. All of the things that, like, in normal social interactions are like, oh, okay, like, I've asked 3 times. They've said no, I'm gonna step back. And the whole point of journalism is, like, you find that line and you go slightly over it. And, like, that's how oftentimes you get into circumstances and situations that become promising. But the only solution I've come up with over the years is to kind of just constantly subject myself to this question. One side of your brain, or not your brain, your soul, whatever it is, kind of pinging off the other. The kind of journalist, like, interrogated by the kind of ethicist. The ethicist kind of, like, interrogated by the journalist. Oh, stop being so high-minded. That's such a great detail. That kind of thing. And I don't think the dialogue ever stops, but I think somewhere in between those two things, you kind of come out with something that feels right.
Sounds like a great play, the ethicist and the journalist. Yeah, no, it's such a real tension. I think that kind of, like, ethical boundary and that tension is something you just develop over time of doing the work for a long period. I think I'd had that experience a lot of, like, interviewing somebody and feeling like I was like taking something away from them. And I think when we created the site, we wanted the site to really be in service of the community while also writing about them as well, because of a reaction to that kind of tension that we felt a lot of times in reporting on this beat. But it's tough, and it never really gets easier, to be honest. It's a week from the election. Have you heard about this election? Yeah, yes, it's happening a week from today. I appreciate you being here, actually, given how...
The Prop 1 that you guys are talking about, the
course,
proposition,
yes.
the ballot measure
Yeah.
to protect equal rights.
Absolutely, tied to immigration, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that. Jonathan might have to split a little bit early as well, because all these reporters are on crazy deadlines this week. Immigration has been a central topic of this election. It has really defined the race. Both candidates have some similar, some very different approaches to this beat. What are the kind of different ethical considerations that are going to arise for you all, depending on who wins the presidential election? I think one thing that comes up a lot in all immigration reporting is, like, do you conceal the name of somebody who you've spoken to because they might suffer different consequences? Is that something you might be more lax about in a Trump presidency versus a Harris presidency? I would love for all of your takes about how you're thinking about how the beat might evolve post next Tuesday. Do you want to start us off?
I was banking on the.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, all right, yeah, we can start that side. Yeah,
Shouldering the burden.
yeah.
Oh man, I think if there's one general sort of feeling I have, aside from just outright fear and anxiety, it's that it's very hard to know. So let's start with this sort of most nightmarish possibility, which I'll not even go the full distance in naming. If that were to be the outcome, what keeps me up at night over and above just general feelings of worry and panic about people and communities and so on. One is what we don't know and what we can't immediately know, and what, by virtue of not being able to know or even fully predict what some policies or enforcement postures might be coming out of a new administration, steering someone into harm's way, or just kind of moving through a space where there are very serious existential risks for people, and you, as someone in a position of privilege and power, by which I mean, being fully documented, being a member of the press, whatever it may be, these things don't impact you the same way it would impact some of the people you're talking to. And so I remember from the first Trump term, a very specific fear I had was the way in which the kind of general tilt of journalism suddenly felt and looked and was different. That, in prior administrations, you might have a more conservative or more lax administration in regards to immigration enforcement, say. But the very general paradigm was that if you brought kind of responsible, careful attention to someone's story, that was a form of protection for them. I think that was a kind of generally accepted, I mean, obviously this is a generalization, but that was a kind of general premise as I had felt it and understood it. That, okay, someone is going through this horrible, complex thing, some terrible injustice has been visited on them, or they're in this excruciating limbo. By shedding light on what they're going through, you're giving them a measure of visibility, and that visibility couldn't hurt the person. It could only help the person. There's a lawyer out there who reads the story and wants to help. Maybe it becomes harder for an administration to crack down in a particular way because there's press attention around it. And it has, in fact, been the case. This isn't just a kind of pie in the sky feeling. I know for a fact that during the George W. Bush administration and during the Obama administration, and you can say, well, don't be so naive, don't read too much into this, but just as a very kind of almost trivial example of this, the people around the DHS secretary, the Department of Homeland Security secretary, would keep a file of stories that were in the press. And that would sometimes temper, it was a PR thing for them. It wasn't kind of an overwhelming humanitarian thing for them, but there was a feeling of, ooh, you know what, this dreamer is going through this situation. We need to tread lightly. It's generating a lot of headlines. You go into the first Trump term, and I think suddenly the pendulum swung in a very scary and just for me personally, an unprecedented direction, which was people who talked to you suddenly were targets. And there was a kind of unrepentant and even gleeful sense of, anyone who's sort of spoken to journalists or whose stories are out there, whose details are out there, are suddenly potentially at risk. So, and there are specific, we could talk about this, there are specific kind of enforcement priorities that the Trump administration in its first iteration discarded that would allow for a much kind of more random outcome where really anyone could be picked up for anything if they were undocumented, as opposed to people who had committed certain kinds of crimes and so on. And so in the early days of the first Trump administration, and some people who had been writing about before Trump won that election, as you all remember painfully, that outcome was a shock. Certainly was to me, and it was to the people I was talking to. So you had people who had already shared a lot about themselves, who had already really put themselves out there in some form or another, suddenly looking up the morning after the election thinking, wait a second, I don't even know what's coming. And I remember a very fitful period where I basically enlisted personally sources who had been high up in previous administrations at DHS and at the kind of enforcement agencies that would do a lot of the ugliest and most sort of threatening work, and sort of sounded out with them. These are people who are now retired or out of the game or gone back into private practice, but just wanting to be sure, okay, if I'm thinking this thing through, what are the sorts of details that could get someone into trouble? Help me understand the boundaries of what identifying details might be. easy enough to take out someone's last name, easy enough to use someone's middle name rather than their first name. But what about like an address? What about a general address? I don't mean someone's like home address, but the town. You know, if someone really reading and scrutinizing a story could kind of read between the lines and figure out roughly who you were talking about if they lived in a small community. How likely is that? What are the sorts of details that would kind of prick up the ears of a nice officer, and so on? And it was total guesswork. I did not, I had no illusions about what it was. But my point is just there was a real kind of, I think, great responsibility on reporters in that moment when so much was up in the air and so little was known, to do all the due diligence you could possibly do to make sure, to try to correct to the extent possible for blind spots. And so I worry most about that, about kind of the introduction of new blind spots. And in the Trump phenomenon, each iteration gets harsher and more extreme and less accountable. And so it's hard to know. I think, sorry, this is very long-winded. The short of it is, I would say radical humility, like on the level almost of diffidence, of like self-doubt, in terms of questioning what you're doing and what it means for the people you're talking to.
Can I add on? I think that this sort of circles back to this idea of informed consent. Like, I'm not an immigration attorney. I have no idea what the consequences could be. Like, if that means that, like, I consult an immigration attorney or the person talks to their immigration attorney, I've had, like, I was not covering immigration during the Trump era, so I'm sort of, like, learning this now. But, like, I did a very long interview with somebody who had been arrested, and, like, I talked through what they had told me with their immigration attorney, and they were like, well, take out he was born in Colombia. And I was like, what? Like, I didn't know, like, it just had not even occurred to me that, like, that could be used against him in a case. And, like, I think you guys have the mentality at Documented of, like, do no harm. And so just being like, I don't know what the consequences could be, and like making sure that you're not that the immigration attorney can dictate what you do or don't use, but I think like having conversations with your editor and other editors about like, okay, the immigration attorney says we can't use, or it would be bad if we said that he was born in Venezuela, and like talk about that and have the conversation, I think, about like little pieces of specific facts that could actually have a really detrimental impact on the people that you're working with.
Yeah, and I would just say on that, I mean, I think this is one of the real tensions in this, is that, the impulse, the journalistic impulse is to get, every single detail, every single colorful moment, example, and really bring all of that up, and that sometimes, taking out that he was born in Venezuela is like a real detriment to the story. I mean, the story won't make sense anymore, maybe, if you take it
grow
out.
up in.
Yeah,
And then
so,
there's
yeah.
like plausible deniability.
Yeah,
I was
so
like,
what?
what?
I think that's where you have to do is that you have to, I think, sort of, but then there's moments, where you're sort of dealing with both. You say, okay, so, you also have to say like, okay, what is the purpose of this story? Like, what is, is this just because, using this colorful flourish like makes the writing more, exciting, or makes me feel like it'll sound better? Or, is this part of the story really essential to explaining, this phenomenon, or maybe this injustice, or maybe this thing that's happening to this particular person from this particular place? And, and saying maybe I could leave out what he was arrested for, but I could negotiate with him to put him where he's from. And, maybe I can, that I think that you have to be constantly kind of, having discussions with your editors and thinking about it for yourself of like, what is essential, what's not. And, and having that kind of like humility to be like, okay, well, maybe if it's really going to put this person at risk to say that they're from Venezuela, and if I can't say that in the story, like maybe I need to find somebody else to put in the story, and like maybe that's really painful and hard and means like, triple the work for me because then I have to find somebody else. But maybe you do that because, I think that there's, you're constantly weighing the both, but I don't think that you necessarily want to say like, okay, I need to have this in because the story will be bad because of it, or I don't need to have it in, because I'm just listening to what the immigration lawyer says. So you have to kind of, constantly be weighing those things back and forth.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that piece about do no harm and also the worst case scenario of you publishing this story and then something happened to somebody is going to feel way worse than you adding that small detail. So I always try and keep that in mind. I'd love it before we go to questions, if each of you actually could just explicitly outline what your publication's policy is around naming, because I think that's something that comes up a lot generally. So do each of your publications have, I know the New Yorker probably has guidelines around when it's okay to conceal a name, like what kind of bar has to be met before you're saying, okay, I feel comfortable not naming or using initials or giving somebody a fake name or taking out their last name or something.
I think maybe usefully here, I can say very straightforwardly that we do not have a policy one way or the other. This is in no sense as kind of clear cut as a matter of magazine policy. I may be speaking out of turn, but just from my own experience, it's varied, story by story. And I think what's meant the most to me as a writer in these situations is I've always felt the support of my editor. I've never felt that I've been at cross purposes with an editor who is driving to over-include, whereas I'm being more cautious. So in that sense, I do think that there's, if not an explicit policy at the New Yorker, then at least a kind of ethos there where, I think they defer a lot of times to the reporter because the reporter is the one who spent the most time with the subject in question. There is an element of the New Yorker that is a very dramatic part of the editorial process, which is fact-checking, which essentially consists of a team or person in the fact-checking department essentially re-reporting the story, which means getting everyone back on the phone and putting them back through conversation, which, we didn't talk about. This is kind of an idiosyncrasy. I mean, it exists everywhere, but it's such a kind of creed at the New Yorker that there are very specific, it means very specific things for me as a reporter dealing with people in the world to prepare them for what that process is. To first of all explain what the hell it is, because I think it's like bewildering to people. And I used to be a fact checker at the New Yorker, so like I have been the person causing great bewilderment on the phone. Like what? I talked to this reporter like 3 months ago. Who are you? Where are you? But in regards to your question, it comes up because it gives people. I mean, part of that is all about, of course, making sure the facts are accurate and everything is rigorous and so on. But it is also more meaningfully, I think, a chance for people to be acquainted with what's going to come out in the story, to what the sorts of details are that are in the mix. And that can mean how someone is identified. Now, it's tricky because like what you guys are both describing and what I find to be a very dramatic part of this process is this kind of constant addition, subtraction of elements. This detail would make the story so much better, but it introduces these problems. Okay, is there a middle ground we could seek? No, okay, well then maybe this person doesn't fit, or maybe this person does, but we'll use this person for a different section of the story, and on and on and on and on. Immigration lawyers, I love them. They do God's work, but they can be antagonistic to you as a reporter. I mean, I've referred people to immigration reporters, and then they've come back to me and said, "Okay, my client doesn't want to speak to you." And I was like, "I put you in touch with them," which is like a good outcome for the world, but frustrating when you're trying to write a story. So you're always navigating these elements, and so you're going to get, and it's tricky at the New Yorker, I have to say, because you're dealing with people in the story, and this is at every level of power, whether it's someone high up in government or someone who's very vulnerable going through an asylum hearing. They're getting a lot of opportunities to hear the details of a story, and it's only human to hear those details and to get skittish, or to say, actually, you know what, I'd prefer that, or what about this? And so it becomes really this, if you're not straightforward and also kind of firm, it can kind of become this intractable, endless negotiation with all parties, and that doesn't help anyone. And so I like made a habit too. Before I never have someone talk to fact checking without my walking them through everything myself. So I basically, it's exhausting for them, and it's insanely exhausting for me. It drives me crazy, but it means that you're hearing it all from me first before you're hearing it from someone you've never met. That to me, that is a very important thing, and I say that to everyone at the outset. But it does, part of that is also aimed at setting them up to feel more comfortable and not shocked by, oh, wait a second, you used that detail? ooh, and my name's next to it, like, oh, I don't know. Like, better that it should come from me ahead of time. So like that's on you as the reporter to be kind of mediating that continuously throughout the process, because there are going to be these weird editorial hitches that the people you're talking to have no response. Like, it's not incumbent on them to understand how to navigate those very academic questions.
Yeah.
It's on you.
Yeah, and I would just say too that it's another theme is that it can change over time. Like I don't know that, I just recently started at ProPublica, but at Reuters at least, we were very much against using fake names, but sort of open to first names or middle names. And, and sometimes that would change over time. Like there was one story that I was doing about a family that had been separated under Trump and was, we started talking to them before Biden was elected. And so they didn't even know, what would happen afterwards. And then once Biden got elected and there was this sort of potential process of them being reunified, this is a woman who'd been separated from her daughter when she was like still breastfeeding, and she was deported to Honduras. And so when we started, and we ended up doing like a series of stories over probably like a year. And the first ones were when she was still in Honduras, the first couple ones. And so in those ones, we just used her first name. And then, once they ended up going through this whole process of actually like being part of the reunification effort. And then so when she was brought to the United States and, and I've been talking to her all over this time and we had this relationship, she was very much open to using her full name. And so the story then, it was still sort of the same character, but now we had her full name. So I think that, that can happen over time, just as if you have a source, at some early in the process who wants to be anonymous, and then, later when you do other stories, then is willing to come out and use their name. So, but even in that case, I mean, because I had spoken to her so long, she shared with me some like very intimate and very painful details that it had to do with her and her daughter and stuff like that, and never told me not to use them. But I actually just decided not to put them in just because it involves her daughter. And, there was certain things where it was like, I'm just going to sort of make an executive decision on this to not, I don't need it for the story, and I'm not going to put it in. So you can also feel free to do that in your own judgment if it's not necessary, even if somebody's completely open and telling you things that are, very painful and don't have a problem with you publishing them.
Does the city have a naming policy before we jump to questions?
We don't have a standing policy. It's sort of like a case by case, always in touch with editors, being like, this is why they're saying they're afraid of this. In our case, like people are living in shelters, so there's housing repercussions on top of immigration consequences. And yeah, very receptive to like withholding people's information once you like talk it out, basically.
Amazing. All right, so we got some time for questions. I don't know how we want to do this with mics or folks just want to stand up. Okay, great. All right. Got one back there.
Hi, my name is Verena. I'm from Russia, and I'm covering migration from post-Soviet space. A lot, like it grew significantly over the past 3 years. I have an ethical question for you, because once I heard a story from one of my interviewees, and I didn't know what to do with this, and I still don't know, because he told me he was sort of famous in Russia in one like opposition movement, and then he came here because he was in danger of being in prison and stuff, and he was invited by an like Russian activist community here in the U.S., and they told him like, hi, please come, we're gonna cover you're a lawyer, everything's gonna be great. And then he came, and it appeared that these people who invited him, they were not real oppositioners, but they thought that if they have pictures with him, then their cases will be like approved. So they thought it will be very good to pay for his lawyer to make these pictures with him. And this story is like very sad and cynical, and I feel like it's worth being covered, but on the other hand, I'm afraid that it's gonna undermine trust to other people who are like real asylum seekers, just because of this, few people who try to make some advantage of the whole system. How would you go about this? I ended up not publishing it just because, What
Yeah.
would you do?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think one thing that often happens in immigration reporting too is that there's sort of an assumption of, everyone's an asylum seeker, and, but also part of the reporting is that the system is also kind of rife with fraud, and, also has a lot of, very legitimate people with serious claims of fear, and then, shady lawyers who are taking advantage of people and, are faking things. And I think that to sort of ignore that part of it is also, it's also part of our job to sort of write about things in, sort of a 360 view. So I think that, you sort of have to come to it to say, okay, well, whether or not, is there a story there? Like maybe, those people who are, taking advantage of this guy, I mean, maybe it's part of a bigger system that is taking advantage of more immigrants and is legitimately putting, the claims of, real asylum seekers at risk. Maybe that is something that's worth writing about. Or it could just be, a shady person who is taking advantage of this one guy, who maybe that is, it's too bad, but maybe it isn't a story. So I think that you have to kind of have an open mind about the fact that these issues aren't always black and white, and all, immigrants aren't great people and or bad people, or just like in any journalistic exercise, right? So, I think it's just good to kind of have your antenna up all the time, because and there might be somebody who is a legitimate asylum seeker but is also lying about something, or and so just like any of your say, is this going to make it through fact checking, you're going to have to kind of keep that in mind all the time through the process.
And you can write that story in a way that's nuanced, right? Like, you don't have to be like, this is a good thing that's happening or this is a bad thing that's happening. Like, things that happen are often like really murky. And like what you're saying is like, you can highlight like organizations that are helping Russian asylum seekers in like an effective way, and like get their comment in a way that sort of makes it, you can have somebody in the story being like, this undermines all da 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 da. So you can tell that story without having it be like good or bad for a specific group, if that makes sense.
Not to belabor the answers, these are great. It just, you guys are saying such interesting things. It's giving me an idea too that, one thing that maybe helps in thinking about this, it's a fascinating situation, is like to distinguish between what's a plot point and what's a theme. Like that's a fascinating plot point. And one of the liberating things about making that distinction, I mean, first of all, it requires some extra work on your part to sort of like assess whether or not that is a one-off thing, or if that connects up to a bigger systematic issue, that there's a kind of story you can organize around that fact, or whether that's just a kind of detail in a different story that leads in a different direction. The liberating thing about making that distinction is, I do think, and this is, I think both of you made this point, plot points you have to be able to tell. Even if they're ugly, and even if people can wrench them out of context and be manipulative about the implications. Like, there's only so much you can do. You can't kind of withhold details because you're concerned about how a bad faith reader might extrapolate from them. You can make conscientious decisions about, okay, am I going to foreground that fact as though it is a definitive reality of the asylum system, or am I just going to have this be a plot point in a bigger story? And as a plot point, it's fascinating and it's tragic and it's complicated because it connects up with all these bigger systematic questions. But that's maybe a way of organizing it in your head too.
Amazing. Do we have any other? Right.
Hi, thank you for the panel today. It's been amazing thus far. I'm curious, the last time you were asked by an interview subject, hey, you're going to send me that story before it publishes, right? Can I see it? Maybe an immigration lawyer is asked, maybe it's the subject themselves, but I'm just curious, when you're covering immigration, how do you break the news that, yeah, we're not going to show you the story before publication. That's what fact checking is for. But I'd love to hear you say it.
Well, I think you just say that, and you say that, but in this spirit of what we were talking about in terms of this sort of no surprises approach, you can, if I'm quoting somebody, I don't have any problem calling them on the phone and saying, this is the quote that we're using, and because I do feel like that, it not sort of saying, this is the quote we're using, do you want to change it? That's more like that, so that basically anybody who's in your story knows what is being published about them, especially if their name is attached to it, and to check that it's correct. And I think that in any sort of rigorous fact-checking process, you sort of get to the point where there should, I don't think that somebody should get a story and say, oh, I've never heard of any of this stuff before, right? I think, and in different publications, there's different layers of that. Maybe they've heard it, 5 times from 5 different fact checkers, but at least they should have, heard it from you in the same way that you sort of send no surprises to, going back to, any company or politician or saying, this is what we're reporting. Do you have any comment? You can do that with immigrants or anybody that you interview.
Yeah, I think just echoing that bright red line, never, and you can, like, people ask me that not that often, occasionally, not just migrants or immigrants, like people that you're like, what a newspaper, like sometimes press people, I'm like, no, like, what are you doing? But yeah, you can't do that. But yes, you can, sometimes people only talk to me if they're like, can I see the quotes you're going to use beforehand? And like, depending on the situation, I may or may not agree to that. And then sometimes they look at the quote and they're like, oh, actually meant it like for the, and it makes the quote actually clearer than when they sort of said it offhand. So like, in that case, I don't, if they're like talking factually, they want to change it, I'm like, absolutely not. You said this at this time. But if it's like, a preposition or like something that doesn't change the substance, then that I'm also open to doing that.
All I'll say is, revealingly, I've only ever really been asked by people who should know better than to ask it, which I think in a way is interesting because I'm willing to get on the phone with someone and march them through the article, and just verbally. And oftentimes I'll actually do that in Spanish. Like, I've obviously written this thing in English, and like it wouldn't even mean anything. I mean, I don't feel comfortable. That's a line I'm not comfortable sharing a text ahead of time. But I have no problem getting on the phone and being like, all right, you want to have a full sense of the context? All right, here's where the story starts. I described it, and I'll narrate it in my own words or translate it simultaneously, whatever. But I often find that the people who ask are people who are trying to be controlling and know that they know that that's like not a normal ask, but they kind of want to see what would happen and maybe make something out of it, which makes it, I think, that much easier to say like, sorry, I can't help you.
Hi, great. Thanks. Great panel. Thanks so much. I'm curious about, all of us are concerned with this kind of precept or this pillar of doing no harm to the individuals and communities we're reporting on. I'm curious, and we all know that the pre-2016 kind of rules of immigration reporting have changed dramatically in this new context, and I think we're all tracking that it's going to change even more potentially in a couple of months. But what kind of fear do you all have for the future of immigration reporting, which wasn't even really a beat until the last kind of 20 years, right? Until the kind of crises of Latin America, starting in Latin America and now kind of across the world, have kind of come to roost here in the United States, and it's kind of exploded as a kind of object of reporting. But how much fear do you guys have in a future of almost anonymized immigration reporting? And I'm specifically about, I assume all of you guys at some point have worked with a photographer, and especially in the realm of kind of visual journalism, right? It's much easier for you all to use a middle name or drop a last name, but in the future, and I get this asked a lot, can we use a silhouette? Can we use a detail? And I have a real fear of a kind of future of anonymized immigration reporting, because of the great power of immigration reporting over the last 20 years has been to create experts people who are deep inside these communities, who understand them in a nuanced way, and to introduce these people who were, kind of faceless masses. Now we know who they are as individuals, not as stand-ins for a process, not as stand-ins for a political debate, but as individual people motivated by individual circumstances, right? Like I have a real fear of moving forward where we find this balance, it might end up being a kind of silhouetted middle name only kind of reporting.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard. And, I think always, I think for all of us, the preference is, people's full names, being open to being photographed, being open to video. I mean, obviously that is the power of that greatly increases the power of the storytelling that we can do. And as you say, the impact that I think that it can have. And, and that's also part of this negotiation process that we often will let people just, take a photograph of their hands or the back of their head. And, and sometimes you have to have kind of the power of the story to, carry it forward. But I think that in terms of like connecting with the readers, in those cases where there have been people who've reached out and said, I want to help this person or I want to do this thing, that happens way less often if you don't have, somebody's face to it. So, I don't really actually have an answer, just to say that, like, I think the endeavoring to sort of not default to that should continue, I think, but just maybe the sensitivities around, when you do it and you don't, will be heightened, but that the goal should always be to try and, elevate people's stories as much as possible and, in their real voices and their real faces. And
Just to add, by way of not having a definitive answer, it's a great question. Honestly, I had never thought about it in those terms, which betrays my biases as like a print journalist who's not having to think about the images. And in fact, I get to roll my eyes about the photographer coming along, even though that's like the part that everyone will engage with. No, of course. No, Fred is the best. But the funny thing, the reason why I hadn't maybe particularly thought of that, and I do think we're still many steps away from it. I think that like we're kind of over-representing a little bit the caution because we're talking about kind of ethics, and so we're really hammering home the idea that do no harm is something that that's a meaningful precept. But there is a lot of leeway, even when people are in precarious situations, if done responsibly and thoughtfully. And I do think you're always. It occurred to me that earlier we should have just made explicit. You are always pushing for the full thing. You're not. I do actually. This is an important, just as an aside, as a sort of journalistic imperative. Do not start someone off. Do not offer someone an anonymizing handle. You don't sit down with someone and say, "Listen, don't worry. We can use just your first name. No, we can use your middle name. No, we can change your name." If you ask someone, they're always going to say yes. Just as a matter of basic common sense. I mean, if I were asked that, I would say, yeah, okay, sure. You mean I get to talk to you and like strip out like my name and my identifying information? Sure, why not? This is not being manipulative. It's being transparent. You start with the straightforward ask, and then and then depending on someone's level of unease or discomfort, you modify and you land on an outcome that works. But do not start someone with the lowest bar, because then you can't stand it up from there. That's a very important thing. And sometimes you want to communicate to someone that you're doing this in good faith. And so you overrepresent the degree to which you can bend over backwards. But if you start there, it's very hard to move forward from it. But to go to this question, the thing that actually concerns me more in the present moment is that for all of the flood of great immigration writing, I actually worry that people have become desensitized to a lot of the details and stories because they're familiar. There's a sort of finite number of genres and subgenres on this beat and in this area. And like every publication has its separate arsenal of shapes and tools for how to tell these stories. Whether that is like certain sorts of stories or certain lengths of stories or starting a story with a person and then panning out. I mean, we're all familiar with the journalistic tropes. That it generally is helpful and accessible to people in the world. You're reading a Times story or wherever in a newspaper, and you know that the story, whatever, starts to funnel down into increasingly specific details. And so you start more general and then you get more specific. It allows you to, as a reader, to kind of skim or to know where to look. But I actually worry often that in the immigration space specifically, people are like, oh, right, they started on a story and it's like, oh, right, I'm familiar with like some of these shapes, or like, oh God, this is just going to be such a tragic thing. I know I should read this, but am I going to read it? And that's the thing that scares me the most, that like these things begin to feel so familiar that they almost feel formulaic, even though you're dealing with the details of someone's life. And so that, to me, just raises the degree of difficulty for storytelling. You have to be very conscious. Both of you, I think, have said a version of this, and I 100% agree. To be very deliberate about the story you want to get across. And like, even if that means that like maybe someone's journey to the United States was a truly insane plot with unbelievable turns of events. If the story you're trying to tell about that person concerns something that happened once they're here, you have to be smart about starting that story, having the aperture open in the right place. Because if you start with a long tracking shot, to mix the metaphor, someone's gonna zone out, someone's gonna tune out. So that's the thing actually that haunts me even more, is the fact that even with the specificity, the form is getting so familiar to people, or that immigration stories now are becoming to people like, oh, a story about the border, which it's obviously not, and so on.
Thank you for that. That was a great question. Would you mind identifying yourself? It sounds like you have a background to this space as well.
My name is Victor Blue. I'm a journalist, and I've been working in Central America, and I work on immigration stories here in New York City constantly, and I've been working in Guatemala for 20 years. So I'm very interested and concerned with the future of it. Keep going, we're gonna get better.
And by the way, I do want to hear more from Victor. He is, assuming he's not pulled away on assignment, he's going to be participating in our next event, which is on ethics of photojournalism, which is November 19th. So we'll send out announcements on that, but Vic is going to get them last couple of times. He's amazingly thoughtful on these issues. So come to that event.
I
Same place,
saw-
same time.
I don't know if we got time. I saw 2 questions here. If we could have those and wrap up.
Yeah, we'll do 2 more.
Maybe both of you could ask. You ask first, and then pass the mic back.
Yep, thanks. I'm currently for a class trying to cover the migrant shelters concentrated in Long Island City, since there's a very high concentration there. And in doing that, I've sat in on immigration hearing meetings, and I've spoken to a few organizations there in order to try and get more in. But I just wanted to hear if all 3 of you could speak about what you've been doing covering the migrant crisis in New York City recently, just who exactly you speak to, what exactly you do, just so I can get more of an idea of what you guys are up to.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jessica. I'm studying at Columbia right now, and we just started new classes. And I'm taking a class on profiling migrants and immigrants. In our first class, we talked about, and you guys touched on this slightly just now, about nuance and desensitization, but how so many immigration stories are overwhelmingly negative, and sometimes they are portrayed in an over-victimized way. So how do y'all balance that in your reporting? Are you actively seeking more positive stories, or are you just trying to, stay nuanced in your reporting? How should we navigate that while we're reporting on this beat?
Amazing. I think, Gwen, maybe you could take the first question.
Sure, yeah. I spend a lot of time just hanging out outside shelters. Not so much anymore, because now I have like so many contacts, but like if you're focusing on that neighborhood, a great way to get sources is just like hanging out and chatting with people smoking cigarettes and coming home with their kids, and 7 out of 10 people are going to be like, I'm busy. And then like 3 people will be really chatty. And like those chatty people might have something interesting to say. And like, it's a numbers game. At least I found it's just like, you have to find the people that are willing to talk to you, because in any crowd, there's going to be people that want to talk to you and people that don't. And so it's just like, trying to connect with those people. But I think what you were saying, talking to organizations that are working there, I'm sure there's some mutual aid groups that are involved. Were you sitting on random on or were you meeting people in Long Island City and then going to their immigration hearings?
I had met people at Long Island City,
Uh-huh.
I had also heard of this, and I got to immigration court. I met
Yeah.
with the I forget what the record officer, and he was able to find 2 judges who were willing to let me sit in on all-day
That's very
hearings.
cool.
So it was everybody from the city, not
Yeah.
specific from there.
Yeah. So I think you're doing the right thing. I think the challenge that you might have is like, what is the news story as opposed to like just a topic, and that's always very hard. That's
Great. And yeah, if either any of you want to take the second question about how do we tell positive stories, kind of give more of a balance of the type of reporting that's out there about immigrants.
Well, I think going off what you said about the new, you sort of what's the news story, you know, what's the news? I think part of it is just sort of knowing what is a good story that's different than what's been told before. And, you know, I think sometimes, you know, that could be that maybe, you know, maybe it's not necessarily about a person at all. Maybe it's about some sort of systematic thing about, you know, like I did this story about these, you know, charter airline companies that are, you know, charging tens of thousands of dollars to bring people from India through Nicaragua, right? Like, and that there's people that are involved in that, but the actual story is about the system, right? And the actual story is about the companies that are making money off of these people, and you know, and maybe it's not so. And so there's something that is sort of surprising or different about it, and like, and I think also sort of going into, you know, and I think part of it is like if you're in the country, you know, if you've reported outside the United States in some of the places where people come from, then there's also stories about like what they did there, or, you know, things about their country, or things that are sort of like completely unrelated to their immigration experience, which might be worth, you know, highlighting in some other way and kind of trying to find something new. So I think that, you know, to counter this like very real problem of kind of people tuning out immigration stories like that, I think is a real challenge and a real sort of goal to try and say, okay, like, you know, a lot of people have gone through similar experiences. A lot of people had a lot of negative experience. Like there's been, you know, thousands of people that have gone through a horrible experience going through the Darien Gap. But like, do you want to, you know, is that the story that you want to pull out? Or is there something else that you could tell that would illuminate some other aspect of this that hasn't been told before? And I think that, you know, part of that is just the work of, you know, looking for the news in some ways.
And I think people are like through and through what liberates you from what feel like overdetermined dynamics, like a positive story, which maybe feels needed but unrepresentative, or overcooked or contrived, or a negative story which just feels like, God, this is just, is this beat really only just about depressing, horrible things that happen? What unlocks the terms generally are people, because people are the most, that's the whole game, you know? People are full of contradictions and every range of emotions and sensibilities. And so one way of thinking about the system, so to actually flip Micah's point, because that's 1000% valid and the thing, but there's also a kind of corollary, which is, you know, and this is something I toy with a lot in my work, is, can I explain the system? Like, what if rather than kind of frontally trying to characterize the system, I can like actually tell the story of the system through people all the way through. And you know, that way you can draw out different things, because if you put someone at the center rather than a crushing, bureaucratic, unfeeling system, you can tease out absurdities in the system. You can tease out, you know, contradictions and hypocrisy among lawmakers or policymakers. But the question is always like, where do you rest your lens? And if you find the right, so I would say one answer is to spend a lot of time trying to find the right sorts of people, whose you can basically learn from them and follow them. And I think it like actually elevates everything, beyond kind of the terms that we all seem to have to inherit from the system or from the politics or whatever.
And I think just to add on, if you're talking about profiles, like a person can be going through a really difficult thing and also like go dancing, or like met a man here, or like people navigating their lives are also, humans doing more than just like trying to fight the immigration judge or like hating their housing situation or whatever it is. And so I think like any story that's difficult, you can also include the things that make them the weird person that they are, what the music that they like. And I think that like specificity is not just around covering migration. I think that specificity brings depth to any type of reporting that you'll do.
Yeah, and there's some, just to like go off of that, like there's sometimes like the negative and the positive go together. Like there was one story that I was doing in Guatemala that was about like kid violence, basically teenagers like murdering each other. But then I found a story of this two teenagers that were in rival gangs, and they were supposed to kill each other, and then they fell in love, and they sort of like then got married and had kids, and so it's like there's you can sort of, it's sort of the both and, you tell the positive and the negative story together.
On that note, that's an amazing story. I think we'll wrap up. Can you give a round of applause to the amazing panel?
I want to thank the panel, but especially thank Mazen, who organized the whole thing, who found these amazing panelists. And I've seen lots of potential in relieving myself of the moderating chores and giving them to an expert like Mazen. So thank you all.